Hello, and welcome to another edition of T2RL Talks. And in this edition of the podcast, we're going to be talking about aggregators. What are they? What do they do? Why are they important? And what's happening in their market? In the studio with me, I have Ian Luck, who is the president of T2RL's distribution practice. We have Yuna Huellou, who is a senior consultant based in Auckland, New Zealand, and enjoying the evening there as we're in the morning in the UK and Ireland. And I have Amanda Campbell, who is T2RL head of research and now appearing in her second T2RL Talks podcast. So good morning, good evening to all of you.
Morning.
And let's get cracking. The reason we're doing this podcast on this subject right now is that T2RL is about to publish its survey of the market for aggregators. And in our definition, that is non-GDS aggregators. And that distinction is quite important, and we'll no doubt talk about that. I'd like to just start, though, by understanding some definitions. What is an aggregator? How does it work? And what is the difference between an aggregator and a consolidator, which is another one of those strange animals running around the distribution landscape? And who better to ask about that than Ian Luck? So Ian, what are your definitions?
Thank you, Ian. Yes, that's an important definition to be clear on, and something we often discuss with airlines and others. A true aggregator is connecting and bringing content from multiple suppliers. We'll talk mainly about airlines, but they would work with hotels and others as well, potentially. So they're bringing content from multiple airlines and providing that content either via a GUI, a desktop, or an API to a travel agent, a travel seller, TMC, etc. In some ways, consolidators do similar things, but a consolidator is typically accredited by IATA, and the consolidator is issuing the ticket and taking responsibility directly to the airline with things like payment, or if there was an ADM that needed to be sent, that would be sent to the consolidator, and the consolidator may allow smaller agencies, unaccredited agencies to book, but the consolidator is the agent of record as far as the airline is concerned, whereas an aggregator sits between the airline and the travel agent and is never kind of responsible for taking the customer's money, being involved in that part of the transaction. There are companies who do both. Trip.com was the majority owner of Travel Fusion. And so it's not difficult for Travel Fusion to issue tickets using an IATA. Duffel, one of their marketing pitches when they were set up was that, they would make it incredibly easy for somebody to sell travel, including because they set up an IATA and they could issue the ticket and so on. So they're trying to make it kind of the minimum effort for a travel seller that might not be a traditional agent to sell. So there's definitely kind of some people who sit across both.
Okay, so that's kind of understandable that maybe sometimes when we start talking about these things, we do blur the distinctions a little bit, and we talk about the same companies with slightly different roles in the distribution chain. But essentially, a consolidator is someone who actually participates in the transaction, whereas an aggregator is someone who basically puts the parties together to make the transactions.
Yeah.
And I think it's good that we understand that distinction. Amanda, I'm going to come to you because you've been largely responsible for managing the process of gathering the data for the aggregator market report, which we're about to publish. And I think it's safe to say that this has been a bit of a baptism of fire for you in your new role as head of research for T2RL, because some of the existing data that we started to gather maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago has turned out to be a little bit flaky, shall we say, to put it kindly.
Yeah, I don't know about flaky, Ian, but certainly it's been difficult to grapple with. But I think that's quite understandable, really. I mean, we are in an industry that's being defined by transformation. We have constant shifts in terms of the players and the roles that they play in the ecosystem. And I guess, the role of the aggregator probably was, first, the newer aggregator was introduced, a few years ago. And ultimately, the people who were starting out in that business were, very bullish in terms of their projections and, very excited for the future. So in the past, we saw quite significant anticipation that the industry would grow to a certain extent. Now, absolutely what the data shows this year is that there is a continued uptick in terms of volumes and being processed by the aggregators, and certainly that early ambition has borne out in the research from this year. What we are seeing, though, is maybe a little bit more of a nuanced understanding as to how those early projections are maybe leveling off or plateauing to a certain extent. So yes, data collection is difficult. I think that the more that we do, the more understanding that we have, but it's always on against the backdrop of a constantly evolving landscape, which can make it a little bit flaky sometimes, but also makes it a really interesting space to be in and to be keeping the finger on the pulse of. So challenging but fun.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we don't, as is often the case, we don't think there is a definitive source of this data anywhere in the world. And so, we work with aggregators who fill in surveys. We collect our own data on NDC transactions generally. We kind of put this data together from multiple sources to try and get the best estimate we can. But if anybody in the world has a gospel source of data on the total aggregator market, we'd be interested, but we don't think it's out there. So we think this is a pretty good estimate.
Yeah, I think. Sorry, Amanda, I'm talking over you. That's evil of me. All I was going to say was, looking at the data sets from 2-3 years ago and the data sets from now, I think we've definitely got a higher degree of confidence in the data we have now than the data we had then. As Amanda says, that 2 or 3 years ago, apart from anything else, of course, we had a global pandemic, which was skewing a lot of data collection activities. But in terms of our ability to collect the data now, we have surveyed all of the aggregators we have contacts with. Many of them have provided their own actual data. Some have provided their own projections and their own estimates. And I think generally the data we have now is more accurate than it was 2 or 3 years ago, less accurate than it will be going forward because we're constantly improving. Yuna, you're looking just a tiny bit skeptical. Do you agree with that, or are you still worried that we're relying too much on projections and estimates?
I think, like Amanda said earlier, we're talking about companies in some cases that are forecasting quite significant growth and that are potentially, trying to court investors, and there's obviously an interest there in making their businesses look as healthy as possible. But what we are seeing is that the growth does seem to track when we consider the markets that some of these aggregators operate in and the types of airlines that they aggregate for, primarily LCCs. We'll come on to that in a minute, I'm sure. There is significant growth in those volumes in all channels, not just aggregators. So I think it is a growing channel for sure, as expected, but it may not be growing quite as quickly as we had thought a few years ago.
Yeah, the interesting thing was in the last report we published, the projected growth showed a really big inflection around about next year, the year after. We were showing sort of steady growth up till 26, and then all of a sudden it took off. And I wonder if some of that was coming from the projections that the new aggregator companies were sharing with their investors.
Yeah, and it may be that some of them do achieve the growth that they're aiming for, and some of them don't. I mean, it's a competitive marketplace, and everybody's going to have a plan that's successful for them.
Yeah.
But some of them are going to do better than others, no doubt. But as you say, so far, actually, we think they're kind of ahead of where they said they'd be as a group.
That's right. That's right. And that's the interesting thing
but
for
there
me.
is a lot more growth to come potentially. Yeah.
Exactly.
Let's
Are
see.
we going to see that big kick up in a year or so's time that they were all talking about 2 or 3 years ago?
The point Yuna made about, maybe we're going to come on to that, about the type of airlines they operate for, is really interesting. I think maybe to go into at this point.
Well, let's pick up on that now. The term aggregator and the sort of interest in the aggregator model really came to general prominence with the launch of NDC. But in fact, aggregators have been around for quite a lot longer than that. And if we look into the data, we find that NDC is actually still not even the majority of the aggregator business. And we see other types of airline, or not other types of airlines, we see other types of connectivity being the mainstay of many aggregators' business. Do you want to talk about that just a little bit, Ian?
Sure. Yes, we certainly do look at the NDC part of the aggregator bookings, and as you said, in some ways that's the bit that there's a lot of kind of interest in from the trade and travel media and so on. But companies like Travel Fusion and others have been working with LCCs now for best part of 20 years. And in some parts of the world, Southeast Asia, Asia Pacific comes to mind as well, there's some very significant LCC hybrid carrier volume. Some of it on proprietary APIs, or the kind of Navitaire or other PSS APIs that are connected. And yeah, we think that when we think of, sometimes we talk to people and people call them NDC aggregators. In fact, NDC is often a quarter or a third of their bookings. It's definitely growing, and they're onboarding more legacy carriers, and some of those NDC bookings are increasing. But we still see a lot of NDC bookings going via direct connects, some of the big OTAs. And so for a lot of aggregators, still the majority of their business is the kind of LCC hybrid space. And there are also aggregators, just to make the data really complicated, that re-aggregate GDS connections and put it in their agency desktop together with NDC bookings and provide that kind of package to some of the agency customers. So we have to be careful we don't count those bookings once in the GDS space and once in the aggregator space. So it's a complex market.
Yeah, I mean, that's generally true of airline distribution, just as an overall topic. You might think you understand it, but then when you dig into it a little more closely, you find, actually, no, it's more complicated than that. I want to talk also about the type of travel sellers who are availing of aggregator services. So we often think of travel sellers as being roughly divided into 3 segments. We have the OTAs, the Expedias and the Bookings and the other usual suspects we know about. We have the big travel management companies who mostly deal with corporate business. And then we have the rest. We have the traditional agencies who are not Carlson, Bag and Lee or in Amex GBT in the modern world, or Flight Centre or whoever. We have the small and medium-sized agencies. My sense is that the OTAs are predominantly going for direct connections when they go for API mediated distribution, and the TMCs are still largely sticking to the GDSs, and it's that other category that are mostly signing up to use aggregator services. Am I oversimplifying that, or is that more or less what you see?
As you said before, it's always a bit more complicated than it appears at first glance. There are definitely, I mean, Expedia publicly has quite a lot of direct connects. Traveleye owns TripStack, that we would have called an aggregator, but is almost their kind of direct connect tech supplier now, as far as I understand it. Historically, the OTAs have used aggregators, especially to bring in LCC and hybrid content. And what I think we're seeing is some OTAs doing direct connections, especially for sort of large airline partners. But if they're selling 300, 400 airlines, then it may be that a lot of the smaller ones, they go and get through aggregators because they don't want to build 200, 300, 400 direct connections. So it can be that there's quite a lot of direct connect volume, because there's some large one-to-one connections, but there's also aggregator volume as well that the OTA is using, as well as GDS as
I was
well.
going to say, the OTAs in general have GDS connections, but do they actually see some benefits from going to maybe a richer API, even if that means coming through another aggregator that they have to bring into the mix?
I think the commentary we heard from the aggregators in the survey, and we do show the data on the types of agencies and where the volumes sit in the report. We go into some detail around that, but I think what we heard from the aggregators surveyed is that there's quite a variety of business models, and it's easy to simplify it down to them just providing a technology service where they're aggregating the content and passing it on to the travel agency. But many of them position themselves with certain value adds in terms of normalizing that content or just solving
financial
problems.
Services, paid currency stuff, those, all kinds of things.
Yeah, so they target those services at specific market segments of travel agencies, where could be OTAs, could be TMCs, where they're then going to be able to compete effectively. And it's not just the aggregation, the technical side of it. There is typically some kind of value add service that comes with it.
Okay, and something Ian said early in the piece is that there's quite a lot of variation regionally. The aggregator model is very important in Asia, for example, in Asia Pacific. We see other examples. Amanda, when you were looking at the survey results, did you see there was a sort of strong regional aspect to the results?
Yeah, 100%. So I think that when looking at the growth of the orders across the different regions, I think that the highest, or actually the average for the year from 2024 to 2025 was about 38%. Now, there's two regions actually that outpaced that average, and I think one was Latin America and Caribbean, followed closely by Europe. And I think this was also borne out a little bit in the proportion of travel seller customers by region. And certainly we can see that Latin America again, Europe and Asia Pacific have the largest proportion of travel seller customers in those regions. And I think in our analysis, there's a couple of reasons why that may be the case. I think in like Asia Pacific, typically the aggregator channel has been very strong. And LCCs and hybrids in that area are much more open to collaborating with third parties and actively, foster those relationships from a commercial perspective. And I think the propensity for aggregators or travel sellers using aggregators in Europe and Latin America really is largely probably a reflection of the high demand for LCC content in those regions. And as we've been saying, aggregators have played an important role in getting LCC content to travel agents or travel sellers for many, many years now. So they have a mature and established place in those regions.
Okay. And I noticed that North America is absent in your thinking there. And I don't think the non-GDS aggregator market is as significant in North America as it is in some other regions. And I would hypothesize that in part, at least, that's due to the very high concentration of the airline market in North America. There are essentially 4 mega carriers in the US, plus, Air Canada and one or two others like Alaska and so on. And the GDSs are still very significant in the distribution landscape in that market, and so maybe there hasn't been the opportunity for non-GDS aggregators to make their mark in that region. Is that a reasonable hypothesis?
I think that's right. Sorry, you go ahead.
Well, maybe there's more to it than that as well. There's very different commercial models in that market because you're talking about airlines that have very large volumes of huge domestic markets. Whereas if you look at the Asia Pacific carriers, if they want to distribute via the GDS, their cost for doing so is going to be quite different than that of a North American carrier that has a huge domestic market. The value of using an aggregator may be stronger in certain regions than the need hasn't been as strong in North America, potentially.
Okay,
Yeah,
and that would be true of Europe as well, of course, in terms of the international domestic balance.
Yes, that's right. But I think building on Yuna's points, I think a difference between Europe and North America is in North America, the main large carriers have broadly stayed in kind of what I describe as GDS full content. Even if American and some others have done some interesting things with NDC, they've broadly kept the majority of their content in the GDS. And they have pretty strong direct channels for all of that domestic volume. And where they have connected outside the GDS to OTAs, that point about large connections between a large carrier and a large OTA has stood out. So I think it's public that American and some of the other big carriers have direct connections with Expedia, for example. So I'm not sure there's been such a need. In Europe, of course, all the three large European groups all implemented fairly complex, interesting GDS models, which is where we start to come onto the commercial points maybe, where there's a difference in the content that travel agency gets, depending whether they go via a GDS that charges the airline or an aggregator that doesn't, as well as the kind of LCC point. Although, yes, EasyJet and Ryanair and others fly international, they tend to fly short haul and they're quite strong direct, and a lot of their indirect volume is via LCC. So, yeah, there's a few things going on that make Europe different to North America, I think.
The rise of NDC in Europe is definitely a factor as well. I would imagine that NDC has had more of an impact there on the aggregator growth than it has potentially in North America. And that's primarily what Ian is saying with the differences of content. And we did get quite a lot of commentary from the aggregators surveyed about, some airlines in Europe have been differentiating content by channel type for quite a long time. But that's intensifying now. And with more and more airlines implementing NDC, the GDSs, as we know, were not as quick to be ready to distribute that content, which left the door open for aggregators to get some market share there and establish it, I think, in Europe particularly.
Okay. And Ian just alluded to something which I was planning to ask you about, and that's business model. Historically, for 30 years or so, since really the GDSs got established in the early 1990s, I guess, was the heyday for GDS growth. It's been accepted that airlines would pay the costs of getting their product out to the travel sellers, but the aggregator model somewhat turns that on its head, and in general the travel sellers pay to use the aggregators and the airlines get a free ride. But even that is beginning to change, I think.
Yes, I mean, if you think about where some of the aggregators started in the LCC space, in some cases they were actually screen scraping to provide the content to agencies, so the airline wasn't paying them, didn't even necessarily want them to be doing that.
And in some cases we're prepared to sue to stop them doing it.
Absolutely. In other cases, I think it was sort of fairly well understood by everybody, the airline, the aggregator and the agency, that those airlines were 80-90% direct. They didn't particularly want to pay to get their content out to the market, but they were sort of willing to cooperate, and agencies were willing to pay a small fee to get access to that content. So that seemed to be the way the LCC kind of distribution model was established, that it was an agency pays model. And then the more traditional carriers have implemented different models. If you look in, as you say, if we talk about Europe, the three large groups in Europe pass on or surcharge GDS cost both for EDIFACT and for GDS NDC. Whereas if you go to Lufthansa, Air France, KLM or IAG's airlines via an aggregator, there's no surcharge. So it appears from that case that it is still an agency pays model, but the content's better if you go via an aggregator. So there's a logic for the agency paying for it. Whereas we see other airlines where they're saying that the fare that they distribute via NDC will be the same regardless of the NDC source. It will be the same depending whether it's GDS, NDC, Direct Connect, or aggregator. And in that case, it seems like, and this comes up in our survey, some aggregators are saying they're starting to see more of the traditional airlines paying them a fee, sort of apparently treating them as kind of like a low-cost GDS in terms of a financial model, and maybe enabling them to compete with GDSs, not because they have better content, but because they're also being paid.
Yeah, and something I noticed just a few weeks ago, there's at least one aggregator, and I will name it, Air Gateway. They have a slightly different model in that they have a subscription fee for their agency customers, and just recently they've removed the per booking fee from some airlines that are selling through Air Gateway and saying, okay, you get this included in your subscription. And that can only be because the airline is paying them, surely.
We don't know for sure, but that's what it would look like. Yeah, no, we don't know for certain. But it does, the survey data we've collected says some airlines, traditional airlines, are paying aggregators, where other airlines, even in the traditional space, were not, and we're trying to differentiate via content. So the market's clearly evolving in that way, and aggregator commercial models are adapting. And I think some airlines have got strong views one way, some airlines are approaching this differently.
Yeah, I mean, the market is definitely evolving, and that's something we've absolutely found in the survey results, not just in changing practices, but also in new companies being created and entering the fray. And how many aggregators did we survey for this report, Amanda?
We had responses, I think, from 36 different aggregators. Now, some of those responses were incomplete, but certainly we have the voices and the opinions of 36 aggregators included.
Okay, and that is still only a sample. There are still more out there who don't talk to us yet, and the market is most definitely evolving. And one way in which the market is evolving, and I don't know if we should refer to elephants in rooms here, but there are now around 90 airlines who've got a contract to distribute NDC via the traditional GDSs. And so far, at least, we consider the GDSs to be a separate entity. We don't include them in the aggregator survey. Do you think the market is going to evolve in such a way that eventually we have to think about the GDSs and the non-traditional aggregators all in the same bucket, or will they remain distinct for the foreseeable future?
I mean, I think over time we're going to have to think more carefully about how that market operates as one market. I mean, they do perform a similar function. Historically, the commercial models have been quite different, but as we said, that may be evolving. 3 or 4 years ago, we would have said that nearly all GDS bookings for Edifact. We had all of the GDS owners saying that NDC was almost irrelevant or less than 1% of their bookings a few years ago. We certainly now have the GDSs sort of talking a lot more about NDC. We don't have a lot of numbers yet. Amadeus talks about several of their NDC airlines having adoption in the mid-teens or even up to sort of a third. I think those were quotes from 6 to 12 months ago, so that the numbers might be higher. But yeah, I think over time we're going to need to try and think about this market as a whole somehow, which is going to be interesting.
Yeah, and as always, nothing stays the same very long in the world of airline distribution. The other big elephant in the room that we didn't talk about prior to this recording, but I think we would be remiss in not considering it a little bit, is the rise of AI tools. And, are we going to see ChatGPT or Grok or whoever beginning to act in this space? Are they going to be doing some sort of virtual aggregation using AI jiggery pokery, and is it going to overtake everything else we're talking about?
Yeah.
Discuss.
I mean, the simplest view that I've seen so far of how AI will impact kind of travel distribution is that it replaces the kind of Google front door. I think Barry Diller from Expedia, the Expedia chair, said, you know, AI means that it won't be that the majority of searches come through the Google search bar anymore. They'll come through AI requests. But I think, as you know, he was representing Expedia, they still see a strong role for OTAs and others being the next stage after that first AI search. You know, there are others, I think, who believe that if AI really sort of extends further down the funnel and can do some of the more complicated things like manage payments and so on, which is that you start to get into personal data and security and things, so it gets complicated. If that did happen, there is more risk to intermediaries, whether they're aggregators, GDSs, OTAs, or others, having their role kind of pushed back a bit. But it still feels a bit uncertain as to, I think the first use case of AI, I mean, Google itself is using AI to do a lot of its searches now. So the first case seems kind of clear. Beyond that, I think it's hard to say.
Yeah. I would say that it possibly actually opens opportunities for aggregators, because we're talking about tech companies that specialize in travel, that understand the complexities of travel incredibly well, and that have been solving the problems of normalizing content, of bringing it together, of unifying content from LCCs, from different carriers, from different products, really well. So I think that they can potentially actually carve themselves out an interesting part to play in that picture going forward. If they're savvy enough to
and I
in
think the GDSs as well would all feel that. And
absolutely.
you see them talking about how they think AI can help them. It's untested yet, but I don't think it's clear that AI will certainly sweep away all of the intermediaries. But there's definitely some unknowns there we don't know about yet.
Yeah, which of course keeps us on our toes and keeps us interested in the way the market develops. I will just put in a small plug here. We a few weeks ago published our thoughts on the potential rise of agentic AI, and if you're a subscriber to t2rl.net, I do suggest you have a look at that if you haven't already. There are some things are relatively obvious, some things are a lot more subtle, and there are many unknowns, both known unknowns and unknown unknowns, as we go forward into 2026. Just as we come towards the end of this recording, again, I just going to call out that we will be publishing the market report on aggregators within the next few days at the time of recording, probably around the time that you're able to listen to this. It will be up on t2rl.net, and I do recommend you have a look at that. There's a lot of data in there, more than we had last time we surveyed this market, but not as much as we will next time, which is always a good thing. Just to kind of wrap things up, I suppose I'll ask each of you, what developments are you expecting in 2026? What are going to be the continued evolution of this model and how it impinges maybe on other models as we go forward into 2026? I'll start with Ian because I'm looking straight at him.
I mean, I'm looking forward to seeing in the space we work in, more the legacy airline space. We do work with LCCs. In the space we work in, looking forward to seeing more NDC growth. Some airlines even starting their journeys in the OSD space, which will drive further NDC adoption and drive more new products, which is all a kind of opportunity for this market. And looking forward to see some of that evolution. Do the GDSs grow significantly in NDC? They seem to be on an upward path, but they're sort of catching up in some ways, but they seem to have the opportunity to grow a lot. Do we see the aggregators continue to make progress? And particularly as we're kind of going past the point where it was just the sort of top 30 or 40 airlines in the world to the next level down. We're working with a lot of airlines that are rolling out NDC that are tier 3, tier 4 airlines as well, and those airlines have got different challenges, and they may need aggregators. They might not do as many direct connects as some of the large airlines. They might need aggregators and GDSs more than some of the. I think we're seeing some changes. I'm looking forward to see how that develops.
Okay, Yuna, how does the world look from down under?
I'll second what Ian just commented on. Absolutely, those are really interesting points. There's some sort of smaller trends that I'm really curious to see play out. There's one of them which we mentioned at the conference and we've mentioned in our reports before is the LCC starting to reach out more towards corporate travel, or there being more interest in LCC content from corporates, whichever way you want to look at it. And the aggregators that we spoke to have commented on that as well. That's a trend that they're observing also. The other trend that I thought that came out of the survey answers I find quite interesting, I'm curious to see how it plays out, is the rising demand for SME travel products, and then the airlines starting to play with content now that they're getting more sophisticated with their retailing capabilities in these more modern channels. Airlines, whether it's LCC starting to retail differently or legacy carriers starting to get smart with their modern retailing capabilities and start targeting those segments. So SME business travel is one that seems to come up quite a bit, and I'm interested to see what happens with that in the next few months.
Okay. And Amanda, you've had your head down in the data for quite a while now. What are you looking forward to next year?
Yeah, so I think I probably agree with Una in terms of, building on what she said. It was the whole LCC sort of NDC adoption came out quite strongly as a theme, an emerging theme in the report. And as Una said, driven by growth and new markets. I think as LCCs are looking to stay competitive and are looking to grow, of course, they're going to seek out new ways to win over customers, whether that's semi-corporate travel or entering new long haul routes and so forth. So all of that growth, I would say, would increase a need for innovation, and that innovation is probably most sort of enabled by NDC, given its rich retailing capabilities. But another thing that sort of I've been thinking about, and I'm not too sure if it's ever going to blow up into something that's a meaningful trend, but certainly I think aggregators, just the fact that they can normalize content from so many sources and make sense of it for travel sellers of different shapes and sizes all across the world. I mean, maybe it's making it easier for new entrants to start using travel content in a different way. So I was thinking about the OOSD status report that we did quite recently. And one of the points in it that I think was quite interesting was that Revolut had bought an agentic AI company. And what they're thinking about doing is using travel content then to create a service, a travel concierge service. And as a way to make their app and their service more compelling and more sticky. So I'm just wondering if, further down the road, we're going to be seeing a lot more non-traditional players get into the space, given the fact that aggregators are smoothing the way. I know that trend and that idea has been around for a while. It's not new, but maybe it's just something that'll become a little bit more easier to achieve as newer aggregators gain more traction and certainly some more capabilities.
And that's certainly the premise that someone like Duffel has put a lot of effort and investment into. So you're not the only one who's thinking that. Okay, so I suppose in a way what I'm taking away from this is that although we very much do a market survey and we talk to people who are in this business we call aggregators, the boundaries are not hard and fast. The boundaries are blurred, and different types of businesses are picking up different aspects, and that's not going to change as we go forward. I think, the point Amanda just made is very good. We are going to see other entities get involved, and they're going to work with the existing aggregators, and there will probably continue to be new aggregators created. All I would really say for certain is that we at T2RL will be continuing to gather data, continuing to compile it, and produce our best understanding of the market for our subscribers. Una, you look like you've got something that's burning on your mind.
Just for airlines that are listening, it's a fantastic opportunity that there is so much variety in the aggregators out there today. But for airlines that are trying to make sense of it and decide who they should be doing business with, we're also here to help. We have a very efficient service that we can work with airlines on to sort of go through, compare, assess, and then contract with aggregators very efficiently. So if you are considering that, please get in touch. We'd love to help you.
And there you go. That's the message from T2RL. We'd love to help, and we'd love to go on producing our analysis and reports for your consideration. So I'd like to thank Ian, Yuna, and Amanda for joining me in this conversation. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'll certainly look forward to talking to you again in the next issue of T2RL Talks. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, everyone.